The Super Bowl is by far the biggest event of the American calendar, and one of the biggest sporting events on planet Earth. But, of course, for many, the highlight of that Sunday night is the halftime show, where some of the biggest names in music have dazzled. Sometimes, though, things don't go to plan. Over the last few decades, there's been more than a few duds, which have left fans bewildered, unimpressed, and downright horrified at some of the performances during that span. Here, we'll look at 10 times that the NFL made a mistake with their booking and took the shine off the biggest night in sports. Number 10, Blues Brothers in 1997. At number 10, we have the Blues Brothers, whose performance in January 1997 left a lot to be desired. This came 15 years after the death of John Belushi, and overall, the performance felt incomplete, with Dan Aykroyd, John Goodman, and John's brother Jim taking to the stage in an attempt to replicate the magic of the classic 1980 film. However, tragedy marked the backdrop to this one, with stuntwoman Laura Patterson dying in a tragic bungee jumping accident in rehearsal just days before this, which led to a reworking of the show on short notice. As the Super Bowl was in New Orleans that year, there was at least some effort to pay tribute to soul and jazz, but this fell pretty flat, with most of the limited praise for this one going to guest performers ZZ Top and James Brown. Brown ultimately did bring energy to the performance, especially in his rendition of I Got You, I Feel Good, but most of the media response to this performance was negative, with many feeling that this was a tired effort. This definitely isn't one for the history books, and comes in at number 10 here. Number 9, The Who in 2010. Next up is one of the most iconic bands in British history, who might have made a better fist of it if they'd played the biggest stage 30 years previously. However, by the time Super Bowl 44 in 2010 rolled around, The Who frontman Roger Daltrey was 65 years old and clearly past his prime as a vocalist and performer. The Who rolled out 5 hits, the newest of which, Who Are You, had been released 32 years before the game in 1978, and this performance would have been the first exposure many young fans would get to the band. It's fair to say that Daltrey and company did not give them the best possible renditions, and many in Miami that night were left disappointed. This marks the end of an era of classic rock, which had included Paul McCartney, the Rolling Stones, and Bruce Springsteen, and probably led the league to change direction going forward. As we'll see later on, this wasn't always a good move. Number 8, Gloria Estefan in 1992. Going back to 1992, we have Gloria Estefan, who was dealt a bad hand for the Super Bowl 26 halftime show in Minneapolis. As the game was in Minnesota, the league made a choice to do a winter-themed halftime show, featuring members of the Miracle on Ice 1980 hockey team and Olympic figure skating medalist Brian Boitano and Dorothy Hamill. Exactly why the league felt that Latin pop superstar Estefan was the right fit for this show is still unclear 30 years on, but she was put out there after a set of winter and Christmas songs to bring some much-needed energy to proceedings. Ultimately, this wasn't one for the history books, but it did have one positive legacy going forward. After this one flopped, the NFL went all out for Michael Jackson the following year, which is generally considered to be one of the best of all time. It just took a flat, uninspiring performance like this one to force their hand. Number 7, Patti LaBelle in 1995. Up next at number 7, we go back to the era in which halftime shows were part entertainment, part commercials for Disney, which is best summed up by this one from Super Bowl 29 in 1995. The godmother of soul, Patti LaBelle, was the headliner for this one, which mostly functioned as a promotion for the new Indiana Jones ride at Disneyland that coming March. Commercials are of course nothing new to the Super Bowl, or to American sports in general, but it's undeniably disappointing that 2 years after the King of Pop lit up the stage in Pasadena, we were treated to an extended ad for Disneyland whilst the 49ers were tearing apart the Chargers. Not even the closer of Can You Feel the Love Tonight could save this show, as America begged for no more Disney-themed halftime shows. But 5 years later, they'd get one last one. Number 6, Phil Collins, Christina Aguilera, Enrique Iglesias, Toni Braxton, and Tina Turner in 2000. For how star-studded this lineup is, you'd be forgiven for thinking there would at least be a few hits dotted throughout this performance. But ultimately, this was another turgid Disney production to bring in the new millennium. The crowd at the Georgia Dome were treated to a show that celebrated the Tapestry of Nations promotion from Disney and saw Christina Aguilera and Enrique Iglesias underutilized in a time when they were two of the biggest up-and-comers in pop. This would thankfully prove to be the last ever Disney involvement in a halftime show, and for good reason. Bringing in Phil Collins and Toni Braxton also seemed an odd choice, as the show appeared hastily put together and lacked any coherent theme other than a promotion for the Walt Disney Company. At least the game was an all-timer here, with the Tennessee Titans famously ending up 1 yard short against the greatest show on turf, Rams. But for fans of halftime shows, an all-time flop here. Number 5. New Kids on the Block in 1991. Moving into our top 5, we have the Super Bowl 25 halftime show from the boy band New Kids on the Block. This one marked 25 years of the Super Bowl and was another Disney effort, with the band joined by Hall of Fame quarterback Warren Moon and 2,000 local school children for a cheesy show which most have now forgotten. As was the case for many of the shows of this era, the main performers didn't play many of their hits, with the focus instead being on the children's renditions of I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing and It's a Small World After All, with minimal New Kids on the Block throughout the performance. On a legendary Super Bowl night, which began with Whitney Houston's iconic national anthem performance and ended with Scott Norwood missing right, the halftime show was absolutely the lowlight. And to make it more forgettable, it wasn't even aired live, with ABC showing a Gulf War bulletin instead, not one for the record books. Number 4. Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake in 2004. At number 4, we have probably the most infamous halftime show of all time. In 2004, Nelly, Kid Rock, P. Diddy, and Jessica Simpson all performed in an ensemble halftime show. And yet, no one remembers any of this from a show totally overshadowed by one moment involving Justin Timberlake and Janet Jackson towards the end of the performance. The show suffered some technical audio issues, according to the sound engineer Patrick Baltzell, but the show wasn't a total disaster, with Nelly in particular providing a solid performance. But just as it looked to be a solid, unspectacular halftime show, Timberlake and Jackson performed Rock Your Body together, culminating in Timberlake tearing off part of her top, fully exposing her breast in front of a TV audience of over 100 million. This led to a moral panic and furor unlike anything ever seen before or since at the Super Bowl. Thus, Nipplegate was born, marring the show forever. The backlash over this near enough killed Janet Jackson's career and ended MTV's involvement in the show forever. Following this, the league seemingly vowed to play it a lot safer going forward. Number 3. Maroon 5 in 2019. At 3, we have an all-time stinker of a halftime show from Adam Levine and his band Maroon 5. For the first Atlanta Super Bowl in almost 2 decades, many had hoped for some representation of the city, from the likes of Ludacris, Childish Gambino, or Migos. Instead, the NFL settled for Maroon 5 in one of the most dull halftime performances we've ever had. Maroon 5 have never really been an exciting or interesting band, and their renditions of Girls Like You and Sugar were never likely to set the world alight. However, the NFL had arranged for guest appearances from Travis Scott and Outkast's Big Boy to at least add some energy or excitement to proceedings. One of the lowlights came when a performance of Sweet Victory was teased as a response to a petition from SpongeBob SquarePants fans as a tribute to the show's late creator Steven Hillenburg. But the hopes were quickly dashed, as the clip from the show immediately cut into sicko mode by Travis Scott, leaving many SpongeBob fans disappointed and feeling that the league had missed the mark on this one. A botched tribute, a boring performance, and an all-time dud of a game as the Patriots beat the Rams 13-3. And yet, we still have 2 worse than that. Number 2. Black Eyed Peas in 2011. In 2011, the Black Eyed Peas were at the peak of their cultural relevance, having had 3 #1 hits off their album The End, and arguably being the biggest group in America at the time. So it was a no-brainer for the league to pick will.i.am and company to mark the greatest show on earth. Right? No. Not at all. Frankly, this show was a disaster from start to finish, as neither will.i.am, Fergie, or the rest of the group sounded good at any point, due in part to terrible sound issues throughout Cowboy Stadium. A rough rendition of Boom Boom Pow was followed up by an odd guest appearance from Guns N' Roses legend Slash, who performed Sweet Child of Mine, whilst Fergie just sort of awkwardly stood near him. Even a guest appearance from Usher, performing one of his worst songs in OMG, couldn't rescue this one, which was clunky, poorly executed, and negatively received by most, as it entered the pantheon of all-time bad Super Bowl halftime shows. It also put a serious dent in the career of the Peas themselves, which they've never fully recovered from. And yet, we still have one more that tops it. Number 1. Kendrick Lamar in 2025. The 2024 season Super Bowl halftime show saw hip-hop superstar Kendrick Lamar headline in New Orleans, which had some who had hoped for more local artists like Lil Wayne or a tribute to the city's jazz history upset. Instead, Kendrick was given 15 minutes to effectively carry out a victory lap for his beef with Canadian rapper Drake, which had come to a boiling point over the summer. Even many diehard Kendrick fans were left disappointed as he played very few of his earlier hits, leaning heavily on a hip-hop beef that many of the viewing public were either ambivalent to or unaware of. The show was mostly disjointed and seemed to take forever, as Kendrick was often difficult to decipher as a result of poor audio issues in the Superdome. This was ultimately a miss from the league, who put forward an admittedly popular rapper, but one with limited crossover appeal, who lacks the hits that mainstream America could recognize on the night of the biggest audience in the nation's history. There were few hooks, few hits, and very few memorable moments if you weren't invested in the Drake-Kendrick feud from the year before. Many in the stadium felt more confused than anything else, and it helped to pile the misery on Chiefs fans, who were watching their team suffer an all-time beatdown at the hands of Jalen Hurts and his Philadelphia Eagles. The halftime show is the highlight of both the sports and entertainment calendars, and most came away agreeing that Kendrick Lamar had failed to deliver on the biggest stage of all. But which of these performances did you think was the worst? What other terrible performances did we miss? And who would you like to see do next year's show? Let us know in the comments.